Hey guys, I'm Papa Pete and welcome to today's episode of the 125. The 125 is my YouTube show featuring one of the 125 different original Intellivision games that were released for the system back between 1979 and 1989. Today's a very interesting one because it's the first game that I've done in the 125 from the INTV Corp period of production for the Intellivision. It's a very interesting game with an interesting timeline, having been almost produced back in the original days and then picked up later on. And it also features one of the most interesting Easter eggs in all of, frankly, I'll say commercial video game releases. Anyway, guys, sit back and we'll take a look at Dig Dug for the Intellivision. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank IntellivisionCollector.com, the official sponsor of the 125. For all of your Intellivision collecting needs, homebrews, original 125, or any supplies, that's IntellivisionCollector.com. After the massive success of Pac-Man back in 1980, arcade maze games were all the rage throughout Japan and North America. In 1982, Namco released an extremely interesting maze game, very different for the time, that was called Dig Dug. In Dig Dug, the player controls the main protagonist called Teizo Hori as he digs throughout the earth, creating tunnels and trying to destroy all the enemies by either crushing them with rocks or inflating them with his trusty air pump until they explode. The enemies consist of google-eyed red pukas as well as fire-breathing dragons called Figars. There are also special items that appear from time to time after performing certain functions that the player can grab for extra points. Once all the pukas and all the Figars are destroyed, Teizo Hori can move on to the next stage. And like so many other games during the golden age of arcade video games, the ultimate goal was to score as many points as possible. Now, if this game sounds simple, it is, but it's also one of the most popular games, actually the second most popular game in 1982 in Japan, second highest grossing game, and it sold over $46 million worth of cabinets in North America the same year, which is absolutely massive. Naturally, with this much success, there is a huge demand to bring this into the home console market. Atari got the rights to these games and released it for the Atari 2600 in October 1983. They also released versions for the Atari 5200, the Atari 8-bit computer line, and also the Commodore 64 and Apple II under the Atari Soft moniker. Also being planned as Atari Soft releases at the time were versions for both the ColecoVision and the Intellivision. Under lead programmer and manager Russ Haff, several different programmers from both Mattel Electronics as well as APH, they left their companies to join Russ and form an Intellivision programming group for Atari Soft. In June 1983, Atari Soft released 3 different titles for the Intellivision under the Atari Soft name, and that was Centipede, Defender, and Pac-Man. But many more were in the works. As you can see here in these pictures, these are some of the titles that were going to be released. For example, in late 1983, they planned on releasing things like Galaxian, Joust, Jungle Hunt, Pole Position. And these were not only being just discussed, they're really being worked on, or they're at least early stages of development. With Dig Dug actually being well underway by programmer Mark Kennedy. Kennedy's port of Dig Dug was in the final stages of development, actually, practically finished when the unthinkable occurred, and that was the video game crash of 1983. It's treated like a moment in time. We talk about the crash like it happened one day, when reality is the video game, or the home video game market, really had been in a free fall for the last several months of 1983. But anyway, in January 1984, Mattel Electronics actually ceased operations, shuttered their doors, and by mid-1984, the Intellivision programming division at Atari Soft, it was also closed. And what this meant is that no other games than those original 3 would ever be released by Atari Soft, and Kennedy's nearly completed version of Dig Dug was left in limbo. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at the time of Atari Soft's demise, Mattel Electronics had already closed its doors, and following the closure, Mattel's Senior Vice President of Marketing, Terrence Valesky, had organized a group of investors for the purchase of the Intellivision name, which also included all the inventory, the rights to their games, as well as unfinished works. Now, Valesky distributed these games, or the existing inventory, under the moniker Intellivision Inc., even producing new inventory of some of these previously existing games. This actually proved to be pretty successful, and so successful, in fact, that Valesky eventually had 4 different games produced, which were I won't say from scratch, but released new titles that had never been previously released for the Mattel and Intellivision before their closure. This also proved successful, and so much so that he decided to buy out all of his other investors. And when he bought out all the other investors, he renamed the company to INTV Corporation. By this point, INTV Corp started taking previously unreleased games, unfinished games even, and overseeing their completion to be released as new INTV Corp titles. One of these titles that they found and they decided to pursue for release, well, it was Mark Kennedy's Atari Soft version of Dig Dug. Now, after they negotiated the rights to the game, one of the biggest hurdles that they had to overcome was the fact that the original source code no longer existed. Thankfully, Blue Sky Ranger Dave Warhol managed to pull the code from a prototype of the game that original programmer Mark Kennedy still had in his possession. Now, with Kennedy back in the mix, he was finally going to be able to see his unfinished work from back in the days of Atari Soft get a well-deserved Intellivision release. After Kennedy removed the Atari title screen from the game and also fixed the few remaining bugs, INTV Corp released Mark Kennedy's version of Dig Dug on June 30th, 1987. With this being a relatively simple arcade port, the controls of Dig Dug really don't require much explanation. You move Teizo Hori using the disc, of course, in 4 different directions, up, down, left, right, and you fire your air gun and pump up the enemies using any one of the 4 side buttons. You don't need an overlay to play this game because the controls are so simple. So like with most INTV Corporation games, there were no overlays included, and that helped cut back production costs. Now, in recent years, though, back in the early 2000s, Psycho Stormtrooper did create an overlay for this game, a really nice looking one too, as part of his Orphan Overlays set. Now, these Orphan Overlays from Psycho Stormtrooper, like I said, they're very collectible nowadays, although there have been agreements and there have been Psycho Stormtrooper overlays released in the complete Intellivision flashback collections that are available from the Blue Sky Rangers. There's none for Dig Dug, but I don't know if it's still possible to get them or not, but at the end of the day, the ones that Psycho Stormtrooper made were excellent, and you can find the actual JPEGs online right now. If you can find an actual set, that, like I said before, they're extremely collectible. Since there's really not much detail to discuss as far as the different controls, right? Move left, right, up and down, and you fire your air gun. Let's look at how it actually transfers over onto the Intellivision controller from the way it is with the joystick and the button in the arcade port. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is I do find the controls in the Intellivision version to be a little bit slippery. When I was trying to turn up or down, precisely above or below rocks, for example, I'd often seem to turn a little bit early or turn a little bit late. I couldn't nail it right on. I really had to focus to get it in the exact perfect location. I'm not saying it was terrible or anything like that. It wasn't. It controlled quite well, but it was, like I say, a little bit slippery, and I found that you really had to focus in order to get him to turn in the right spot. Like I said, as I did it more and more, I got a little bit better at it, but even after I played it quite a bit, I still was missing where I wanted to turn quite often. Now, as for the air gun, I did find that the button presses reacted very well, pumping up the air gun, shooting it out at the enemies, and pumping them up afterwards. I had no problems with that whatsoever. And that's not to say I didn't die doing it, because what would happen is you could hold one, and then all of a sudden a second one would come along. But that's the name of the game. That's the nature of the game, doing it at the right time. So I never felt like I died because the controls weren't reacting the way I wanted them to as far as the air gun goes, but simply because I made a mistake when I was playing the game. When I compare the overall control of the Intellivision version of Dig Dug to the arcade version, I don't find significant difference, and I find a little bit of slipperiness in each one. Now, perhaps the Intellivision version is a little bit more difficult to control, a little bit more slippery as I like to call it, but overall, it's not a whole lot different than the original, and it really is a very good translation over onto the Intellivision system. Now, as with most arcade ports done in systems back in the early 80s, the most obvious graphical change to Dig Dug is the aspect ratio. Changed from a 3x4, like where it's a vertical screen, to a horizontal 4x3 ratio that was common for most CRT televisions at the time. Now, the challenge is to maintain the quality of gameplay while making these adjustments, and frankly, Kenny did a very good job of making this adjustment. Now, the scoreboard in the Intellivision version is a lot more simplified, but it's still up at the top with the player score, then the high score, and then a little notation of exactly what level you're on, but it's just numerical in the Intellivision version, as opposed to having both the number of flowers planted in the earth over in the arcade version up at the top, as well as the round number down at the bottom. The number of men that the player has remaining also is down in the lower left-hand corner in a very simple one-color white sprite on the Intellivision version, as opposed to the more complex depiction on the arcade version. Now, on that note of the sprite colors, the Figars and the Pukas are also now single sprites in the Intellivision version, but they still look very good. The Pukas are missing their goggles, and the Figars, you can't really see their eyes, they're just dark dots, but they're still very distinguishable and they're very well done. Now, as for Taizahori, he's actually two colors in the Intellivision version, red and white. With the air gun clearly sticking out in front of him as he goes ahead and shoots, you can tell that the gun is pointing forward. Now, the background colors are also level, just like in the arcade version, and Kennedy has done a great job of adding texture to the earth to give the screen a nice aesthetic. As far as the animations of all these characters go, it's smooth and it's pretty easy on the eyes. The falling single sprite rocks are well animated, as are the last two animations that I really want to mention here. First, it looks great when the enemies turn into ghosts and they float through the earth towards Taizahori. And finally, the last one I'm going to mention is the animation of pumping up the enemies and making them explode is perfectly done given the sprite limitations of the system. Overall, I feel that Mark Kennedy has done a very commendable job of making the necessary graphical adjustments while maintaining the fun level of the original arcade game. Now, here's something that I don't know if I've ever said when talking about the home console version of a classic arcade game as opposed to the original works, and that is that I think that the sounds in Intellivision Dig Dug may actually be a little bit better than the original. Now, I find the music in the original arcade version that's present whenever Taizahori is walking is very harsh, especially when you consider the music starts and stops as the player starts and stops moving. I find it very sort of grating, to be quite honest. In the Intellivision version, the music does still stop as your player stops, as you change direction, etc., but it doesn't seem to be nearly as harsh, and overall, the music is just a little bit smoother and more soothing in general. And as for the other musical elements throughout the game, they all sound fantastic on the Intellivision system. As for other sounds, such as the pumping sound, the popping of the enemies, the floating ghost sounds, which are very well done, they're all very well done in the Intellivision version. Are they better? Well, you know what?
What?
Maybe they are. Overall, I find the sounds in the Intellivision version of Dig Dug to be better than the original arcade. Now, you score in 4 basic ways in Dig Dug. First of all, you get 5 points for every piece of earth that you burrow through. Next, you also get points for pumping up and popping the enemies, of course. And the way it works is the higher up on the screen the enemy is, the lower the points value you get for it. Basically, if you look at the level, there's 3 different levels. There's 200 worth 200 points, 300 points in the middle, or if you get them way down low, they're worth 500 points. That's the same for both Pukas and Figars, but the difference is with Figars, of course, they breathe fire, so they're much more dangerous to approach from the side. So if you do manage to pump up and explode a Figar from the side, you get double the point value. Thirdly, you get huge points for dropping the rocks on the enemies. And it's sort of exponential as it goes. If you manage to drop a rock and get one enemy, you get 1,000 points. If you get 2 enemies, you get 2,500 points. 3, you get 4,000 points. And then it's 2,000 additional points for every enemy on top of that. Now, I'll be quite honest, I've never gotten more than probably 2 at a time. But I'm sure as you master this game, you might that's one of the skills that you're going to want to work away at developing in order to score the most points possible. Now, the final way to score points is the vegetables that appear when you perform certain functions in the game, such as dropping rocks or blowing up certain things, and they'll appear in the very center of the screen. And you can grab these vegetables, whether it's carrots, turnips, mushrooms, zucchinis, tomatoes, whatever they are, and they gradually become worth higher and higher point levels with each level or round that you progress to. Now, the point scheme for this in Intellivision, as far as I can tell, is pretty much the same as it is in the original arcade game. But then again, like I always like to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, as I alluded to in the opening segment, Dig Dug is very well known for a really significant Easter egg. It's probably one of the better Easter eggs that's available in any commercially released game, actually. But truth be known, there are actually two different Easter eggs in this game. So let's look at the first one before I get into the second one, which is really much more well known. And that's the fact that there's a title screen Easter egg in this game that was discovered by Joe Zabicek several years ago now, and it is activated by holding 1, 5, 9, and enter, while also pushing up and left on the disc and hitting reset. When it's activated, programmer Mark Kennedy is given credit on the title screen. And frankly, I love any addition, any little Easter egg that gives the programmers the credit they deserve for making these wonderful games. Now, that's all fine and dandy. That's a great little Easter egg. But the truth be told, when you think about the Intellivision Dig Dug and its Easter egg, it's not the title screen one that you think of. It's the inclusion of a completely separate game, Deadly Dogs, within the cartridge itself. Deadly Dogs is a Tron Deadly Disc variant created with various sprites from Burger Time, including hot dogs as the main character as well as the enemies. Now, this game has become very, very notorious in the Intellivision community. Now, Atari Age member The Hatman 1 has actually created fantastic cover art as well as an overlay for Deadly Dogs that you can actually see. I highlight them in my Old Guys and Old Games episode that features gameplay from Deadly Dogs. Now, to access this Easter egg, it's really pretty interesting. You have to be use a little bit of dexterity to get it, because what you have to do is you have to hold 4 and 7 on both the left and right controller and then hit reset. The original Dig Dug title screen is replaced with Deadly Dogs, and the player can start with what is essentially Tron Deadly Discs with Burger Time hot dogs, not only as the player you control, but as the enemies. There are minor differences with the scoring levels where different enemies are introduced, as well as with the colors of them, but overall the gameplay is essentially the same as Tron Deadly Discs. So now the question everybody's asking, how did this game get put onto this cartridge and why? Well, the story is that producer Dave Warhol had created Deadly Dogs and had been using it while debugging the software that he'd written to create new INTV games. Later on, while he was working on the release of Dig Dug, Dave realized that there was enough space left over on that cartridge that he could actually slip the entire Deadly Dogs game onto the cartridge with it. So he did, and that's the how it came to be. But what about the why? Why did Dave put it on there? Probably because he could. And I'd just like to sit back and on behalf of all the members of the Intellivision community right now, just want to say to Dave, thank you for putting it on there. It was a fantastic Easter egg and a very fun thing not only to talk about, but to play. Now, like most of the later games, including pretty much all of the INTV Corp releases, I didn't have the opportunity to play them back in the day. We just didn't have them. I was getting older. We didn't buy as many. They weren't as accessible as they were earlier on. But I was very familiar with Dig Dug, though, because, it was absolutely everywhere. So just so you know, I was never really a big Dig Dug fan back in the day, but I can understand and respect those who really did enjoy that game. Sometimes it's nice to go back and look at a game that on one hand you're very familiar with, but on the other hand, you're not familiar with it on that system. So you get to go back and look at it in a new light and focus on its faithfulness to the original game, given the limitations and the adjustments that had to be made for the new system, in this case, the Intellivision. Well, I'm happy to say that Mark Kennedy did a great job porting Dig Dug over to the Intellivision, and even though he had to wait 3 years after Atari Soft's demise, he finally got to see his creation released on the Intellivision system. I'm happy to say the gameplay is accurate, and the graphics are very well done given all the limitations of the home consoles back in the day, not just the Intellivision, but all of them. And as for the sounds, do I dare say it? It's just as good, if not even better than the original. So I have to sum up all of these factors when I make my rating: good graphics, faithful gameplay, excellent sound. But the one factor, that's so positively unique in Dig Dug is the absolutely incredible Easter egg, the inclusion of deadly dogs on the cartridge. It's 2 games in one, and 2 very good games at that. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give INTV Corp's Dig Dug by Mark Kennedy an 8 out of 10 rating. Well, guys, that's it for this episode of the 125 featuring the wonderful INTV Corp Dig Dug by Mark Kennedy. I really am glad to have the opportunity to get back into this game, to play this game for the very first time, because I missed out on it back in the day, but it just goes to show how strong the Intellivision community is this day and age, 43 years after the original release of the system. Absolutely fantastic. Special thanks to Intellivision Collector for being the official sponsor of the 125, as well as to all the different sources and members of the Intellivision community whom I rely on to get the information and learn so much about this fantastic system that I do. Steve Roney and the Blue Sky Rangers, Rev and Intellivision Revolution, and just so many others that are so strong in this community. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with Coco and I here today, and we will see you in the next episode of the 125. You take care.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up by the age of 50, you don't have to.
I'm Mark Kennedy, programmer of the Intellivision classics Centipede, Pac-Man, Dig Dug, and the award-winning Kool-Aid Man. And you're watching Papa Pete, the old guy gamer.
What the hell?